But when human beings have to decide to get rid of each other, then there's real trouble. So a Taoist would be on the whole inclined not to interfere with the course of events, because he feels that they are of a complexity so great that he, with his verbal interpretations, because all that we call scientific knowledge is a verbal interpretation of what's going on, and of certain selection of things that we call good and a selection of certain things that we call bad. Well, he feels that he doesn't really know in terms of words whether a given event is good or bad. He may feel badly about it, but he may feel that this is the proper and appropriate way to feel in such circumstances, and that it will go over. It will pass. For as Lao Tzu said, the fierce gale does not last the whole morning, nor does pelting rain go on all day. Maybe he hadn't lived in Big Sur. But still in general. Then he goes on to say, if heaven and earth cannot keep up these things for long, how much less can mankind? So this then is a basic attitude in Taoist philosophy, which goes by the name of Wu Wei. And that is this. That means Wu, that means negative. And Wei. Wei means doing, interfering, busyness, poking into things. So Wu Wei means don't interfere, don't strive. Really, the best meaning of Wu Wei is don't force it. As when, for example, you're opening a lock and the key doesn't seem to turn. If you force it, you'll just bend the key. So what you have to do is jiggle, pull back and forth, jiggle, 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 until you find the place where the key turns. And that's Wu Wei. Wu Wei doesn't mean total passivity, because you see, on the other side of the picture about interfering with nature, is that you must interfere. There is no way of not interfering. Even when you look at something, you interfere with it. It is, your very existence is an interference with the environment from a certain point of view. So there you are, you're stuck with it. Everything you do alters the balance. Even if you sit perfectly still, you're still breathing. And that alters the nature of things going on around you. You're exuding temperature, and that changes something. And then when you start eating and doing all sorts of things like that, you really do start changing things. So you can't avoid interfering, and yet the maxim is don't interfere, but it means bestly translated, don't force it. So then what do? Well, you have to interfere as wisely as possible. That is to say, you have to find out how to interfere along the lines in which things are already developing. You simply use the wind by putting up a sheet. But then, supposing the wind isn't going where you want to go, then you learn to tack. But you keep the wind in your sails all the time, and you use the wind to go against the wind. And therefrom comes the idea of judo. Judo is the Japanese way of saying the gentle Tao, the gentle way. And in judo, the basic principle of the whole thing is that you are not an attacker. Underneath judo is a deeper philosophy called aikido, the way of aiki. And aikido is that you can never be attacked, because when somebody attacks you, you're not there. Or you are there, but in the form of a vacuum, so that the attacker gets sucked in so fast by his own force that he falls over. So in judo, one always uses the strength of the opponent to bring about his downfall. You may add your own strength at a certain point, In other words, when you're throwing someone in judo, there is a point when his own strength has taken him beyond the peak. You know, when the thing is falling over, it reaches a certain peak where it's gone. You see, it's on the way down. It is at this moment that you add your strength and saying, wowie, you see. When there's a curious throw in judo where you get a fellow, you've been holding him, and you get him up on your foot like this, you see, and then he is moving in this direction. So just when he's off balance, you whoops with your foot like that and send him way over on the floor in that direction. But he has to be beyond the falling point, you see, and then only do you use your strength. Because all you've done now in executing this throw was that you fell backwards with your own weight, and he was pushing at you. You see, at a moment when he was pushing at you like that, it is entirely opportune to put your foot up and fall over backwards, and he goes way over. And that's quite a throw to get involved in, I can assure you. But judo, you see, is a development out of the Taoist philosophy by probably Japanese people. Judo is relatively modern. It comes out of all sorts of understandings, going back to Chinese ways of doing things, and gradually amalgamated into the form in which we know it today. But it is a basic demonstration of this principle of Wu Wei. So it isn't an attitude of total passivity. It isn't just doing nothing, as it literally says, not do, but it's really not force. So you need always, in every situation, to find out which way the wind is blowing. Trim your sails to the wind. This is the meaning of it. Well, now then, how do you know which way the wind is blowing? Obviously, a scientist would say to you, well, we have to make a very careful analysis of the situation and find out just what's going on. And then this becomes extremely interesting, because now scientists are doing this very seriously, and they have devised the very important science that we call ecology. And in ecology we study the whole complex of relationships which lie between any organism and its environment. And when we get to the ecology of mankind, it is simply fantastic. When you study, for example, the ecology between man and the world of microbes, and you try to decide what are good guys and bad guys among the microbes, how to get rid of the bad guys without getting rid of the good guys, and then realizing you need some of the bad guys, otherwise the good guys fall apart. And some of the killers we use are on the level of medicine, very much like what DDT is on the level of agriculture. It's too indiscriminate, and it gets too many of the good guys along with the bad guys. But you become, after a time, very doubtful as to the precise definition of a good guy and a bad guy. Because you see, every group, every species has to have an enemy. That's part of the whole mutual eating society arrangement of life. If you don't have an enemy, then you start multiplying too much. Nothing prunes you. Then you start getting in your own way, because there are too many of you. You start eating up all your own supplies of foodstuff. Also, you get soft. You're not on the qui-vive. You develop flabby muscles, because you never get involved in a fight. So gradually, the successful group fails. The group which managed to obliterate all its enemies will fall apart. But that's the way things run. And the question is, you see, can we run the human race without awful bloodshed, murders and tortures and all that kind of thing? Can we somehow introduce a new kind of gamesmanship as a substitute for war? It's the same thing in business. Exactly. If you wipe out your competitor, then you have no reason to produce anything but a lousy product. And then you may make lots of money because you wiped out your competitors. You've got the whole market. Then you've got this money. What you going to buy with it? Well, there's nothing to buy except other people's lousy products who wiped out their competitors, or who cheated the public by packaging the thing to look elegant, but it was nothing inside. That's all you've got to buy. So naturally, if you're a success in General Motors, you go and buy a Rolls-Royce from England. Or you go and buy a Mercedes from Germany, because they happen to be better cars. Or if you want to make a lot of money in the clothing industry here, making wretched prints, and you want some good clothes, what do? Well, you have to go to Mexico and buy the things peasants wear, because they're still substantial, solid, damn good clothes. So you see, there's something always self-defeating in these attempts to succeed. You could say nothing fails like success. So for this reason, then, the Taoist always had an attitude of caution. Cautious, Lao Tzu says, as one who crosses a river in spring. That means either because of the spring floods or because the ice is still there and you're not quite sure how strong it is, because it's beginning to thaw. So, what the Taoist tries to develop is a sensibility to the situation. He tries to feel out intuitively what kind of action is required under these circumstances, because he feels that he can never discover it analytically with his conscious attention alone. Well, now, to talk in modern Western terms about how this is done, we must realize, of course, that we are equipped inside our heads with an absolutely fantastic thing called the brain. With its millions and millions of neuron cells, it is, as it were, the most amazing computer ever devised. Basic to the Taoist attitude to life is that you have that within you, and you may, if you don't know anything about brains very much, call it intuition or something of that kind. But you have within you the most amazing logical analyzer that exists in the known world. And the point is to get it to work for you. And instead of trying with conscious attention alone, which can only think of about 3 things at a time without using a pencil, that is to say, keep 3 variables in mind at once. Very few people can do 4 without using a pencil. You can do 4 if you're a trained musician, where you're playing 4 different lines of a fugue, say. You're keeping 4 variables in mind at once. With an organist, you can go from 4 to 6 because you've got your 2 feet, and they're playing too. But that requires a high amount of training to be able, with conscious attention, to keep these many variables in mind. But the world around us has infinitely many variables going in it. And you can reason out something with your conscious verbal thinking. Say you want to make a contract in business, and you figure out how to make it, whether it will be a good contract, whether it will work, etc., etc. And you think of all these things and write them down, and you make the contract, and you think that's fine. But one of the variables that you couldn't possibly include in the contract was that your partner would slip on a banana skin and break his neck. The contract might make provisions in it if your lawyer was thoughtful for what was to be done under the case of the disability of any of the parties thereto, etc. But eventually there are so many possibilities that can occur that you cannot think of them all. So then the question arises, is it within the power of the human brain to comprehend, because of its immense complexity, in a kind of un- or subconscious way, what the surface consciousness can never grasp? And the Taoist would say certainly it can. That you've got to learn to use your brain by allowing it to go to work on your problems without interfering with it. And then it will deliver you a decision. And this is why, when you get to the real study of Taoist and Zen Buddhist practice, you get to the point where you learn to act without making decisions. Or rather, to use a more exact word, without choosing. Krishnamurti talks a great deal about being choicelessly aware. And he says freedom is precisely the state of not having to choose. Now that sounds quite paradoxical, because we're always talking about freedom of choice. But choice is not a form of freedom in the sense of the word. What is choice in the sense of the word? Choice is the act of hesitation that we make before making a decision. It is a mental wobbling. You know, some people, when they take up a pen to write, they don't just write, but they jiggle the pen around indecisively like this and then start writing. Or a person comes into a room and wonders who to talk to and sort of is in doubt, you see. In that moment, he's choosing. Whereas a person who comes into a room and decides who to approach, he doesn't wait to choose. We say he is decisive, but that's a funny saying, because it means he doesn't stop to decide. So in the training in Zen Buddhism, which is simply a Buddhist extension of Taoism, Zen Buddhism arose out of the marriage of Buddhism and Taoism in the 5th century AD, and over the following centuries. So they have a way of training you so that you always act without choosing. For example, there was one day a leaky roof, and there were a couple of monks attending the Zen master, and he said, "The roof is leaking." One monk disappeared and came back instantly with a sieve and put it under the drips. Another monk, after some time, came back with a bucket. And the master praised the one who brought the sieve. Now, the action wasn't exactly appropriate, to catching rain. But the point was that he was in the spirit of the Zen discipline by acting without choosing. And you will notice this with certain people. Certain people never hesitate. They always seem, if something needs to be done, they seem somehow simply to grab something and do it, which is a kind of a Zen capacity. So what happens is this, that the teacher of Zen constantly throws curves at his students and puts them in dilemma situations where they have to act immediately. One of the things, of course, that you mustn't do is rush, because rush is a form of hesitation. When a person rushes to get a train, he starts to fall over his own feet. See? So it really holds him up. It's like trying to drive at high speed through the water with a blunt-nosed boat. That's rush. But now what he's trying to get is a kind of a smooth, unhesitating, flowing action that is the response to the challenge. And it must be done with what is called, another use of this word, mu. This is called wunyan in Chinese, or munen in Japanese. And this word, nen, is composed of the character meaning now and the character meaning mind, heart, shin. And so has the meaning of a thought, but especially for us, it is well translated by the psychological term blocking. You're blocking, you say to someone, when they hesitate, when they dither, when they stop to choose. So the attitude of munen, or wunyan, is the unblocked mind, where it doesn't hesitate ever. Just as the river doesn't hesitate when it flows, and just when you clap your hands, the sound comes out without hesitation. And when the moon rises, the water doesn't wait to reflect it. it reflects it instantly. So that instant reflection, or it's a kind of resonance, is what is looked for as a response of the individual to his environment. And he does this to the degree that he knows himself to be one with his environment. Then his capacity for response increases in according to the way in which he feels that he is simply all of a piece with it and not something that is in it and with a barrier around him through which messages have to get, and then their decisions have to be made up and sent out. So then, you could say that a kind of extremely subtle sensory awareness has to be developed as between the individual and his environment, so that he feels it out. Now, today, this sort of talk is very unpopular because scientifically minded people, especially academic scientists, those who teach in universities, are exceedingly suspicious of intuitive reactions. They say, oh, blah, 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 blah. You can get into all sorts of trouble that way. But the thing that they neglect to realize is that everybody uses it. Even the most meticulously careful, analytical, rigorous, sound scientist uses intuitive judgment after a certain point. Why? Because you may accumulate data forever, and you may decide that this is, on the whole, and taking all due things into consideration and procedures having been worked out, that this is the right thing to do. Why do you decide then? Mostly because time's up, and somebody's pressing for a decision, or else you are bored to death with bringing in data, because you never know how much data you need to make a certain decision. And therefore you may go on collecting data till all is blue, but in the last analysis you'll work on hunch. And so much is actually in the end decided by flipping coins. And the pity of flipping coins for making decisions gives you only two choices, heads or tails, one way or the other. The Chinese have a more subtle way of flipping coins. They have a method of a 64-sided coin to flip, so that instead of just heads or tails, there are 64 possibilities of coming to a decision when you don't know what to do. This is called the I Ching, or the Book of Changes, where the symbols of yang and yin, that is to say, for yang, a straight line undivided, for yin, a line broken in the middle. There are 64 ways of combining 6 of these lines in a hexagram. And so there is a complex method when you have to make a grave decision for tossing. You do it by tossing sticks or coins, and it gives you one of these 64 figures. Now, if you are very wise and have studied the Book of Change for a long time, you don't need to use the book. You just look at what the figure is and you can tell what it means. Because you see, these figures are made up of each 6 hexagram figure is made up of 2 threefold components. That has 2 components, of which this one is water and this one is heaven. So you will have water over heaven. And a person very skilled in the interpretation will feel out the meaning of water over heaven. But actually, if you are not so skilled, there is the book. And for each of these hexagrams, the book has an oracle. And it tells you in curiously vague and yet curiously precise terms the meaning of this hexagram. And then you, in the light of your own situation, make up your mind what it's saying to you. in the light of the problem that you've raised, the question that you've asked, the decision that you had to make, you will find invariably that these 64 choices are one of them, or indeed all of them. But you have to pick one of them because you are, after all, tossing a coin. But it has some peculiarly appropriate thing to say to you under your circumstances, and it's just like having a conversation with a very, very wise old gentleman. And you must realize that today in Asia, this book is still widely used for making business and political decisions, although people who are westernized wouldn't let on, perhaps, that they use it. And so anybody who does politics or does business with Asia should be completely versed in this book to know what sort of thinking, what sort of approach might be expected under any circumstances. If you could ever find out what hexagram had fallen when a certain politician had made a decision, it would be immensely enlightening as to his future course of action. In the same way, for example, in dealing with Hitler, our strategists, I don't know if they did, should have been students of astrology, because he was always consulting astrologers. And therefore, astrology would be much more easy to penetrate than the I Ching, because you can know Hitler is looking all the time at his own horoscope. Well, we have access to Hitler's horoscope, and so we know what he's thinking about it. But you don't have access to what hexagram Mao Zedong threw when he decided to do something or other. So it's a little bit more subtle. I'm making the point then that our scientists are very suspicious of the intuitive judgment. But nevertheless, they all use it in the end. And so it has made this suspicion that science has of intuitive judgment has filtered down to the average person in terms of a mistrust of his own intuition, of the marvelous analytical powers of his own brain. And so we are always in a dither of doubt as to whether we're behaving the right way, doing the right thing, and so on and so forth, and lack a certain kind of self-confidence. And if you see you lack self-confidence, you will make mistakes through sheer fumbling. If you do have self-confidence, you may get away with doing entirely the wrong thing. The British have an enormous degree of self-confidence. They know they're right, and they don't even question it. I mean, there are certain kinds of British types who are absolutely, their aplomb is unbelievable. And you can't shake them. I wouldn't dream of it. They're not even defending themselves. They know they're so right. And therefore they can allow any kind of political revolution, total free speech. All sorts of things can go on, which make Americans very nervous, because Americans don't have the same degree of aplomb. They're not quite sure, you see. When you're an aristocrat and you've been brought up for generations in the right schools, and there's never any doubt whatsoever, you don't even have to mention the fact that you're an aristocrat. See? I mean, that's why aristocrats know how to treat servants. But they never take it out on their servants in the sense of having to emphasize their own superiority, because they know they're superior. They don't even question it. See? Well, this is an extraordinary kind of nerve that they've built up. So the only way, you know, you can do this is, first of all, in Zen practice, the thing that you have to understand is this. You have to regard yourself as a cloud in the flesh, because you see, clouds never make mistakes. Did you ever see a cloud that was misshapen? Did you ever see a badly designed wave? No, they always do the right thing. Now, so as a matter of fact do we, because we are natural beings just like clouds and waves. Only we have complicated games which cause us to doubt ourselves. But if you will treat yourself for a while as a cloud or wave, and realize that you can't make a mistake, whatever you do, because even if you do something that seems to be totally disastrous, it'll all come out in the wash somehow or other. Then, through this capacity, you will develop a kind of confidence, and through confidence you will be able to trust your own intuition. Only the thing that you have to be careful about, and many people who have not understood Zen properly fall into trouble here, is that when they take the attitude that I can't possibly make a mistake, they overdo it, which shows that they don't really believe it. So a lot of people come on and say, well, in Zen, anything goes. You're naturally with it anyway. You are a Buddha anyhow, and I'm going to prove I'm a Buddha anyhow by breaking all the rules. So you put on the weirdest, filthiest clothes, and you go and steal things, and all kinds of things like that. That's overdoing it. That shows that you haven't learned. You're overcompensating. Because before you were told to do this, do that, and the other, and watch, and be self-conscious and nervous, and so on. And so you just go to the other extreme. But this is the middle way of knowing it has nothing to do with your decision to do this or not. Whether you decide that you can't make a mistake, or whether you don't decide it, it's true anyway. That you are like cloud and water. And through that realization, without overcompensating in the other direction, you will come to the point where you begin to be on good terms with your own being and to be able to trust your own brain. But at that level, you are supra-personal. That is to say, when you realize that you stand here as a body, it's as if you see, there was, according to certain cosmological theories today, a primordial explosion which blew up and created the universe. And you know how it is when you take a bottle of ink and you throw it at a whitewashed wall, smash like that, and it goes splat all over the place. There's a big blob in the center. And then as it goes out, it gets all sorts of little curlicues and wiggles. So you see, the cosmic explosion is still happening. It takes a long time from that big essential bang for the whole thing to go whoosh. It takes billions of years for it to happen. And it's still happening. And we're the little curlicues out on the edge. See? And we're connected. We are part of the central explosion that originally happened. That, in a certain sense, is in you. You're still manifesting it, you see? So, when you consider yourself as a physical being, consider this hand. It is very ancient. Just like you pick up a stone. Say, how old is this stone? Well, scientists will say, well, it's about, comes from the Pleistocene age, and it's probably, 4 million years old. But then you think, well, wait a minute. You mean 4 million years old? Where did it come from? What was it before it was a stone? Well, it was something or other. And that goes back, you see. So everything you touch, including yourself, is incredibly ancient. Goes back to the very beginning of time. So if your mind awakens, you suddenly see all your friends sitting around you looking incredibly ancient. I don't mean in the sense of old and haggard, but like angels, like eternal beings who were always there from the beginning.
Sounds True presents Leave It Be, Session 7, The Way of the Tao, with Alan Watts.
For the sake of clarity, I want to be quite sure that this whole group has the fundamental Taoist principles clear. Although Lao Tzu started his book by saying that the Tao which can be spoken is not the eternal Tao, he nevertheless went on to write a book about it. And all of us who are philosophers in the poetic sense of the word know very well that we are trying to describe the indescribable, to F the ineffable, and unscrew the inscrutable. But nevertheless, some attempt may be made at it, even if only we use words to show the limitations of words. So in these beautiful characters, we have sort of a summary. There's one word missing, but nevertheless, it will do. The word Tao means something like the way. I would rather call it the course of nature, as we use the word course when we say of course, or when we talk about a watercourse, the flow of things. The character is made up, first of all, of a radical, number 162 in the catalogue. All Chinese words are classified under their radicals. And this particular radical has a basic meaning of motion. And the radical is the part of the character to the left of it and flowing underneath. Rhythmic motion is basically what it means. But you have very definitely here the sense of an intelligent rhythmic motion. But it can't be pinned down or defined because it's too close to us. It is that which we basically are, and all those things that we basically are, time, space, consciousness, are impossible to define, for just the same reason that you can't look straight into your own eyes or bite your teeth. Now, we get anxiety about that because we would like to feel that we were in control of what we basically are. But then, unfortunately, if we were, we'd make a mess of it. Because the controlling mind works on a linear system. That is to say, words and numbers which are strung out in lines, and they are much too simple to take care of the complexities of nature. So be thankful for your brain, which you don't understand, which is completely incomprehensible, but that upon which all comprehension depends. So the Tao which can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. So then the next principle in line is this one, which is called Wu Wei. Wu is a word that means none or not. Wei means forcing, shoving, pushing the stream. And so if you understand the Tao, you do not push the stream. You learn a basic sensitivity to what Charlotte Selver calls your inner, your true feeling. And that needs quietness in order to really understand what it is. I have proposed that the new form of college entrance examination be to write a 20-page paper on your idea of paradise. What you would really like to happen to you. And I find people find this extremely difficult to conceive. Study Western religious art and look at the pictures of heaven. They're very boring. Islamic people had a better idea. When you look at Persian miniatures, Chinese have wonderful paintings of heaven. I asked a Zen master once, what's your idea of heaven? And he said, I remember a Chinese painting of a kind of a summer house in the mountains overlooking a waterfall. And seated around the table, there are 4 gentlemen drinking wine and discussing the classics. And behind each gentleman there is a beautiful young lady who is massaging his back and scraping his ears and rubbing his hair. It is a man's point of view. I would like to see a similar painting of a woman's idea of paradise. I wonder what it would be like. I very much wonder. It could even be the same picture. No, I doubt it. I very much doubt it. Because the reason why I doubt that they would be using sandpaper is one reason why some women become lesbians is that they feel that men are utterly insensitive to delicacy of touch. That they are rough and brutal and have no idea what a sensitive instrument is the harp of a woman's body. That's very important. Some of the best massage that can be done is done without touching. It's simply the vibratory aura of the fingers, whatever this electricity is that comes out of us, passing into the other person's body. And this extremely gentle approach to touching people, we could do it. We could demonstrate, for example, Al and I were doing a wrist dance this morning. But we could do exactly the same thing without touching each other at all. And this achieves such heights of expertise in Aikido that they can throw people without touching them. An attacker comes, I've watched it. There's a fellow at Santa Cruz by the name of Prager, who's a great Aikido master. And I've watched people go slamming at him. And he moves in a certain way, and they fall on the floor. And he never touched them. So we have contacts way beyond the surface of our skins. So to get back here to Wu Wei, this means work on the basis that you and the Tao, which is the water flow of nature, always taking the line of least resistance, are the same. And Goethe understood this. He wrote a marvelous little essay called The Fragment on Nature, in which he said, we go with nature even when we work against her. There is no way out. We may imagine that there is, but that very imagination is itself part of the stream, so forget it. And it isn't that you are being forced, it isn't that you are being pushed around by something external to yourself, because the Tao constitutes the very essence of what you are. And so this character here, Qi, means that flow that is in you and can be experienced physically as breath, although it isn't limited to breath. We need the Sanskrit word prana to assist us here. Prana is vital force, but all these Western equivalents are very tricky. Vital energy, which is manifested in breath. And breath is completely fascinating. First of all, you cannot be sure whether you are breathing or whether you are being breathed, because it goes on when you're not thinking about it. And yet when you begin to think about it, you feel you're doing it. And beginners in yoga who study pranayama, which means the discipline of breath, often get tied up because they think that if they don't remember to breathe, it won't go on. And they get nervous. But of course it will. And the reason why one becomes aware of breathing and does various so-called breathing practices is that you will see through the experience of breath that the voluntary and the involuntary are the same process. That is also experienced in the Tai Chi and other exercises where we dance with each other, say in wrist play, because we discover in that it's impossible to say who is leading and who is following. It all becomes one. And ideal sexual intercourse is the same thing. And not only the actual intercourse, but loving. There suddenly vanishes any differentiation between who proposes and who disposes, who calls and who answers. And this game in Zen Buddhism is called host and guest. If, for example, I meet you on the street and I say, "Good morning," and you say, "Good morning," I'm host and you're guest, because you followed my lead. If I say, "Good morning," and you say, "It's not a good morning," you have reversed the position, see? And you've refused to be guest. Now imagine another situation in which we both said good morning at the same time. Then host and guest, ghost and hest, have been transcended. And we don't know who was the leader and who was the follower. You know, we allow the machine to be the host. So qi may be most simply thought of as breath, although it means our total psychophysical energy. And in Aikido, one might say you imagine an outstretched arm is a rubber hose with water flowing through it to a point at which you look out there, and you simply assume that the arm is immovable. And actually, you could practice this. You can hold your arm outstretched in that frame of mind for an incredibly long time without feeling tired. Just assume it'll stay there. You might think this an exercise in asceticism, but it isn't. It's the simplest thing in the world to do. Just assume that it'll remain, and the qi will flow along. We don't have a scientific explanation for these things, and we call it self-hypnosis, which is a word which has about as much meaning as neuritis, which means your nerves hurt. Doctor says, you say, "I got a pain." The doctor says, "You have neuritis." Okay, it means your nerves hurt. And once upon a time, when the pundits of the West saw a medical symptom that they didn't understand, or a peculiar species of animal or plant that hadn't been classified, they said, "Oh, yes, that's a lusus naturae." And everybody said, "Oh yes, it's a lusus naturae." And lusus naturae simply means a game of nature. So, always, incidentally, this is a kind of obiter dicta, translate medical and scientific language into plain English. You will find that most of it is bullshit. Some of it isn't, but most of it is. So then, everybody really knows what qi is. You just have to trust it. It's like breath. It goes on whether you do it or don't. So, now, let's go back. From Tao to Wu Wei, we come to a character that isn't written here, called De. And that, when we analyze the character, has a radical under which it's classified, which originally meant crossroads. And so, again, it's a motion character. The same radical is used for the character which means moving along. So that is this. So we have moving along, and then a combination of the eye and the vital organs, the heart, next to it. This is translated virtue in most texts. Sometimes it's translated grace, sometimes power. But when we speak of the healing virtues of a plant, that about gets what de means. It doesn't mean virtue in the sense of moral rectitude. That's a more Confucian idea. Taoist is virtue in the sense of certain kind of marvelous competence. For example, we say of some people that they're gifted, that somehow or other they had a capacity like Mozart had for music, which he never seemed to have learned. He always had it. That is de. And often very witty people, good comedians, go on the stage with absolutely no idea in mind of what jokes they're going to make. I remember George Robey, who was a great British comedian, and the moment he walked on the stage, people roared with laughter. He was completely absurd, and everybody expected him to be absurd just when he walked on. And it couldn't be explained, couldn't possibly be taught how to do this. He had de. So in the same way, people who are miraculous calculators, and you can give them all kinds of figures and arithmetical problems, and they solve them without the slightest effort. They can even solve them while in the midst of carrying on a conversation about something else altogether. This is de. It works. And every one of us is possessed of de, because we do all kinds of miracles. Every one of you is at the moment performing all kinds of miracles without thinking about them at all. You're circulating your blood, you're breathing, your glands are operating, which are, from an intellectual point of view, incredibly complex processes. But you're doing them all without any effort, without consideration, without thinking. That is de. So to keep Taoism in mind, you just have to keep three principles in mind. Tao, the flow of nature. Wu Wei, that it takes the line of least resistance, but with intelligence. And de, the third principle, which is the power virtue that is manifested by doing that. So, in other words, I'm giving you an outline so that you've got the system in a nutshell. I don't know whether Lao Tzu would approve of my making it that simple. Now, there are certain other considerations which flow from this, which we might call keywords. One of the important phrases in Lao Tzu is Dao Fa Zi Yan, which means the Tao's principle is of itself so, translating very literally. Dao Fa Zi Yan. Zi Yan, of itself so, is the word that we normally translate nature. So it's the Tao's principle, or its modus operandi, as we would say in Latin, is so of itself, spontaneous. That's very fascinating. Tao is not conceived as a ruling principle in the sense of that which pushes things around. So we have to rethink all our Western notions of the subject of the verb. The noun which creates a process. However nouns can create a process has never been explained. However nouns can generate verbs is a complete mystery. It's a completely unnecessary mystery. But the Tao is not to be considered as a ruler in the sense of that which forces other things to follow. The Tao is the process of spontaneity, of things being so, of events. That makes it simpler if I use the word events instead of things. Of events being so of themselves. Now, what is self-so? When you have hiccups, you don't plan to have hiccups. It just happened. You don't plan to be born. And it's a very great question whether your parents planned for you to be born. And we can always blame the past and say, well, I'm in the situation I am in because I was badly brought up. And then the parents can always say they were badly brought up, and so on. But I've noticed that some of the most extraordinary psychic wrecks come from extremely happy marriages. And in the children. So, we can't, as it were, push the responsibility backwards. Because if you practice your meditation, you will come to the very strange understanding that everything begins now. This is a total reversal of common sense. And this is the meaning of Zheyan. The world starts at this moment. This is the moment of creation. We won't find anything by looking into the past, because our instruments will detect the history of the universe and go back and back and back and back and back until the trail vanishes. However fine the instruments become, they will eventually be unable to detect any trace. Looking in the wrong place. It all begins now. So this is the moment from which you are beginning. And you, not in the sense of your empirical ego, not in the sense of the you who you imagine yourself to be, not in the sense of your image of yourself, but the real you is responsible for everything that's happening. Beginning now. Right now. This is it. Here we are. So, ha! This is it. It begins today. And our brains, inside this shell, is a system of labyrinths that are full of echoes. And those that we call memories. The memories of the past. But they are now. See? They exist at this moment. And there is no other place. There is no other time. And right now it begins because you say so. Not the, I repeat, not the you that you call your ego, but the you which includes every bone and nerve in your body. The you which not only includes what is inside your skin, but the whole environmental world without which and apart from which you don't exist at all. This is all you. Everything you experience is you. And that begins now, and it comes out of the void as the sounds come out of silence, as the baby comes from the hollow womb, as the stars shine out of the womb of space. It begins right now, spontaneously. As a Tibetan poem which has an image of the world arising as a fish suddenly jumps up out of a pool. Starts now. This is Zheyan. Now, another word that is important is si, which means unbleached silk, which is related to the uncarved block. That is to say, a little bit what the Japanese mean by shibui, naturalness in style. And this is very characteristic of the life of a Taoist follower, aficionado. Let's take, for example, the bowls that are used for tea in the Japanese tea ceremony, rakuware, which are very primitive looking, very unobtrusive. They have the general feeling of autumn, of the color of autumn leaves. Glaze has been allowed to run. We get a kind of controlled accident in the manufacture of these rather rustic-looking bowls and pots of various kinds. This is the meaning of the unbleached silk and the uncarved block. Americans today who collect driftwood and rocks have a feeling for this. And this introduces us to a very profound question. What is it that is so marvelous about rocks? About glaze that flows, but when we look at it, we know that it wasn't a mere mistake and it wasn't a mess. Why do photographers make pictures such as we see to the south of rocks? We're at Big Sur here now, looking south, and we see these mountains and rocks meeting the ocean. And hundreds of photographers have come and taken this picture. Why? Well, it's a natural mess, you might say. No, it's a slag heap overflowing into the ocean. You know, a lot of weeds have grown up in it. We call them trees. But everybody looks at that and says, oh, what a marvelous sight. Or we look at the patterns in spray. Look in marble. Look at the grain in wood. What is so marvelous about it? Look at jade. Look at simply the way grass grows over the hillside. What is so marvelous? Nobody can explain. Nobody ever has been able to explain. But there is a Chinese word for this. It is Li. And it means the order of nature. The character originally meant markings in jade, grain in wood, fiber in muscle. And that could be called, Li, could be called the principle of ordering implicit in Tao. Now, let's go back to the phrase Dao Fa Zheyan. the second word, fa, which means the principle of the Tao. I'm going to equate fa with li. Now, fa is the word the Chinese use to translate the Sanskrit dharma. And dharma is, say, the Buddha's doctrine is called the Dharma. And therefore it has a sense of method in it. But normally, Westerners translate it law. And this won't do. Because law implies the principle contrary to Wu Wei, not forcing. Law is always forcing. Law enforcement. And you will not get order through law. You'll get disorder. For the more the laws are in evidence, as Lao Tzu said, the more thieves and robbers abound. So law simply will not do. To lay down the law